Hello, everyone. My name is Kendra Ellett, and this video is about my literature review on positive behavioral interventions and supports and their effects on school-wide disciplinary exclusion rates. The intent of school disciplinary policies is to preserve order and safety by removing students who break school rules and disrupt the learning environment. However, schools tend to rely heavily on exclusion from the classroom as the primary discipline strategy. And disciplinary exclusion refers to out-of-school suspensions and expulsions. Since the link between school discipline practices and juvenile justice contact is strong, it's essential for us as educators to reduce the rates of school-wide suspensions and expulsions. So, as follows, the purpose of this literature review is to explore if positive behavioral interventions and supports programs impact school-wide disciplinary exclusion rates. And from here on out, I'll refer to positive behavioral interventions and supports as the acronym PBIS. So a little bit about myself. I'm a general education math teacher. I teach in a middle school, and I'm passionate about building wide equity, but specifically how disciplinary policies impact all students. And my school is looking to make our PBIS program more robust in efforts to tackle our discipline issues. So this topic really sparked my interest, and I want to explore if PBIS systems affect school-wide disciplinary exclusion rates. I was not able to complete an action research project this semester. My school is not writing referrals since we are all remote. So my methodology is just carrying out the steps of a literature review. Before I dive into my findings, I thought it'd be helpful to give a brief overview of what PBIS is. If you look at the infographic on the right side, it shows that within PBIS, there are 3 different tiers of interventions, and this literature review focuses on the Tier 1 practices. And major components of the Tier 1 practices are having students consistently identify school rules and be able to describe what following those school rules looks like in each of their learning spaces. And from the teacher side, when students' behavior models what's expected, students are praised, and that praise comes in the form of a token system where that positive behavior is recognized and rewarded. So as I looked through the literature and put together the themes, 5 major themes emerged regarding the data. So it's the school-wide effect of PBIS in primary schools, intermediate schools, and urban schools, as well as the effect of PBIS on certain student subgroups, and PBIS improvements as a result of the fidelity of implementation. Starting with primary schools often provide students their first exposure to PBIS programs. The first study to discuss is Sherrod's 2009, where the researchers sought to address the increasing discipline referral rates experienced by a suburban elementary school and implement and analyze the effects of the PBIS program. After a full year of implementing PBIS, the school saw a 26% decrease in the number of discipline referrals. The number of physical aggression referrals decreased by 40%, which is notable as this is typically one of the biggest reasons for disciplinary exclusion. And a year later, Bradshaw in 2010 completed a group randomized effectiveness study. The study was completed on a larger scale than Sherrod's 2009 study, but the intent was the same, to determine an impact of PBIS on school discipline problems. For Bradshaw's study, 37 public elementary schools, both rural and suburban, were volunteered, and 21 of those schools implemented PBIS, and 16 were assigned to the comparison condition. And after 5 years of implementing the trial, Schools who implemented PBIS experienced significant reductions in out-of-school suspensions, in contrast to the comparison schools. So, taken together, both Sherrod and Bradshaw's studies reflect the finding that school-wide PBIS programs do reduce disciplinary exclusion rates for suburban and rural primary schools. As for intermediate schools, it's recommended intermediate schools use prevention-oriented approaches to handle problem behaviors. And one example of that is the Tier 1 PBIS system. So, in a 3-year effectiveness trial without random assignment, Flannery in 2014 gathered participants from 12 different high schools. 8 of those schools implemented PBIS, and the other 4 were comparison schools. The study lasted 3 years, and referral data was collected, specifically referrals over delinquencies, school safety, and severe problem behaviors, as those resulted in out-of-school suspensions or expulsions. And after the PBIS implementation period ended, the results showed statistically significant decreases in student discipline referrals in the schools who implemented PBIS. The comparison schools actually saw an increase in their number of referrals. So, even 4 years later, Flannery's 2014 study reflects the findings that PBIS programs do reduce disciplinary exclusion rates in elementary, middle, and high schools. As for urban schools, many students in these urban areas look to school and their teachers to provide stability and an appropriate model for behavior. Starting with the case study in 2012, Feuerborn explored student discipline outcomes 1 year after a PBIS program was implemented in an elementary school. During the baseline year, staff issued 60 out-of-school suspensions, and during the implementation year, staff issued 34 out-of-school suspensions. No expulsions were documented either year, but the change from the baseline to implementation years amounted to a 43% reduction in out-of-school suspensions. In a 2004 study by Lassen, the 3-year longitudinal study of this PBIS implementation in an urban middle school mirrored the results of Bradshaw's 2010 study. The target middle school for Lassen's study was located in an urban area in the Midwest, and during the baseline year, staff issued 684 referrals per 100 students, and during the last year of PBIS implementation, 522 referrals per 100 students were issued. So there was a decrease there as well. So taken together, major implications from these studies show school-wide Tier 1 PBIS implementations are effective in reducing student problem behaviors in urban schools that have high rates of misbehavior. As for student subgroups, research on school-wide disciplinary exclusion rates has generally focused on how out-of-school suspensions and expulsions significantly increase the risk of poor academic performance, as well as a decreased investment in following school rules and an overall lack of connection to school for all students. However, further analysis of these actions reveals disproportionate disciplinary consequences among races and ethnicities and students with disabilities. So this section, I chose literature that addressed students with disabilities as well as Black students and how PBIS implemented the disciplinary exclusion rates for those subgroups. So in 2018, Gage completed a quasi-experimental design analysis to examine the effect of school-wide PBIS on disciplinary actions in a little less than 600 Florida schools. The results of this study found statistically significantly fewer out-of-school suspensions for students with disabilities and Black students. In another state-level quasi-experimental study, Grassley Boy in 2019 compared 544 schools implementing PBIS to 544 schools which hadn't had PBIS training. After this course of the study ended, the results were statistically significantly fewer out-of-school suspensions across students in schools where PBIS was implemented, and students with disabilities were statistically significantly less likely to be sent to alternative settings due to behavior in schools implementing PBIS school-wide with fidelity. So, the implications of these studies show that PBIS can have profound impacts on student outcomes, especially those students who are already marginalized. Moving to fidelity, it's notable that the previous studies indicate school-wide PBIS does reduce disciplinary exclusion rates, but it's worth noting not all of the studies reported fidelity of implementation data. And without this data, researchers can't say with certainty whether or not the treatment effects vary by how well schools implemented school-wide PBIS. So for this section, I looked at a 2018 study by Gage, a 2019 study by James, and a 2014 study by Flannery. And all of these studies showed that school-wide PBIS significantly reduces problem behavior for students, but the degree of reduction is significantly related to the degree which the critical features of school-wide PBIS were delivered. There was another study by Childs in 2016 who also examined the relationship between a school-wide PBIS implementation and the fidelity measure. And Childs argues there appears to be an immediate drop in discipline incidents when PBIS is implemented with fidelity, and the drop is sustained across time but does not decrease at a rate any different than schools implementing with less fidelity. As far as limitations, the first one is that a vast majority of the studies were completed in timeframes of less than 5 years. And a researcher in 2016, Young, argues that in order to sustain positive effects of PBIS interventions, future implementation efforts need to emphasize administrator support and ongoing high-quality professional development. So that is another area to continue to explore on this topic. Another gap in the research is looking specifically at PBIS programs and their impact on disciplinary exclusion for Black students. While the research shows suspensions and expulsions for Black students were reduced in schools implementing PBIS with fidelity, these students continue, however, to be disproportionately disciplined when compared to their white peers. So this information suggests a more culturally relevant PBIS system could be an avenue to explore as well. Based on the research reviewed, it's evident school-wide Tier 1 PBIS programs reduce disciplinary exclusion rates for students in primary schools, intermediate schools, and urban schools. Furthermore, school-wide PBIS programs specifically decrease out-of-school suspensions and expulsions for Black students and students with disabilities. All of these studies were consistent in reflecting these relationships. Those schools who implemented PBIS with fidelity saw greater changes. Next steps for me. My reason for completing this literature review was to learn about school-wide PBIS systems and how they impact school disciplinary exclusion rates. And if PBIS is implemented with fidelity, the school I teach at could see positive results in terms of less students enduring out-of-school suspensions or expulsions. At some point in the future, I'd like to complete an action research project exploring what happens when kids are followed from one school to another to see what the effect of the continuing or ending of PBIS has on their school behavior. That concludes my video. Here are my references. Thank you for watching.